On January 30th, 1649, a bitterly cold day in London, a scaffold was erected outside Whitehall Palace. Thousands gathered in silence to witness an unthinkable event, one that would shake the foundations of Europe. On that scaffold stood not a traitor or common criminal, but their king, Charles III, the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. For the first time in history, a nation had tried and sentenced to death its own divinely anointed monarch. This was no shadowy assassination. It was a public execution carried out in the name of the people of England. Charles was not a bloodthirsty tyrant like his forebear Henry VIII. He was a faithful husband, a loving father, a refined art collector. So how did such a king meet such a tragic end? The answer lies in a deadly inflexibility, an absolute belief in his divine right, and a complete failure to understand the people he ruled. This is the tragedy of a man who believed he was above the law only to be crushed by it. Charles was not born to be king. The second son of King James I, he was frail and stammered, overshadowed by his talented and popular elder brother Henry. Charles grew up in his brother's shadow. But in 1612, Henry died suddenly of typhoid fever. Charles, a shy 12-year-old, became heir to the throne. This tragedy left a deep mark, shaping a serious, reserved personality always driven to prove himself. Unlike his sociable, somewhat disheveled father, Charles prized dignity and order. He believed the monarchy must embody majesty and stability, a belief that would set him on a collision course with his subjects. When Charles III ascended the throne in 1625, he inherited a troubled legacy from his father, an empty treasury, an increasingly assertive parliament, and a notorious favorite, the Duke of Buckingham. Instead of reconciling differences, Charles exacerbated them. He married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess alarming a Protestant English nation. He continued to trust Buckingham, who led England into disastrous and costly wars against Spain and France. When Parliament refused to fund his wars, Charles took it as a personal insult, a challenge to his divine authority. He retaliated by dissolving Parliament. The relationship between king and the people's representatives broke down from the outset. In 1629, after relentless conflicts, Charles made a fateful decision. He dissolved Parliament and resolved to rule alone. This period became known as the 11 Years' Tyranny. To raise money, he used creative but unpopular financial measures like extending ship money tax, traditionally levied on coastal towns in wartime, to the entire country. He imposed archaic fines and fees. Legally, he was within his rights. Politically, it was a disaster. He alienated nobles and merchants alike. Meanwhile, his Archbishop William Laud sought to impose a high ceremonial, near-Catholic form of worship on the Church of England. This enraged the devout Puritans who dominated Parliament. They believed the king was trying to drag England back to Catholicism. The breaking point came from Charles' homeland, Scotland. In 1637, Charles and Laud tried to impose a new Book of Common Prayer on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The response was immediate and violent, a riot legendarily sparked by a woman named Jenny Geddes hurling her stool at a preacher. The riot escalated into a nationwide rebellion. The Scots signed a national covenant vowing to defend their faith. Charles tried to crush them by force, but his ill-equipped, unmotivated army was humiliated in the bishops' wars. Worse still, he ran out of money. Charles had no choice. After 11 years, he was forced to recall Parliament to request funds. The king and Parliament were on a collision course, one that would tear apart families, friends, and a nation. If you want to know how political disagreements turned into a bloody civil war, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is the moment England tore itself apart. When Parliament convened in 1640, they had no intention of granting the king funds. They came with a long list of grievances. Led by figures like John Pym, they arrested and executed Charles' closest advisors, including Archbishop Laud and the Earl of Strafford. They passed laws to ensure the king could not rule without them. Charles felt cornered. In January 1642, in a reckless and desperate act, he stormed the House of Commons with soldiers to arrest 5 leading opposition members, but they had been tipped off and escaped. When Charles asked the Speaker of the House where they were, he received a historic reply. "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this House is pleased to direct me." Charles' action was a blatant violation of parliamentary privilege. He had declared war on his own people's representatives. Both sides began raising armies. The English Civil War had begun. The war raged for years, dividing the nation into Cavaliers Royalists and Roundheads parliamentarians. Initially, the Royalists had the advantage with their elite cavalry, but Parliament had longer-term strengths control of London, the Navy, and the country's wealthiest regions. Most crucially, they created a professional fighting force, the New Model Army, led by 2 brilliant generals, Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. In 1645, at the Battle of Naseby, the New Model Army crushed the king's forces. Charles was finally defeated. In 1646, he surrendered to the Scots, who later handed him over to the English Parliament. The king was now a prisoner. Even as a prisoner, Charles believed he could still win. He tried negotiating with Parliament, the Scots, and sparked a second civil war. But this only convinced radicals in the army, especially Oliver Cromwell, that peace was impossible while the king lived. In January 1649, Parliament, now purged of moderates by the army, established a High Court of Justice to try King Charles I for treason. The trial was unprecedented. Charles utterly refused to cooperate. When asked how he pleaded, he repeatedly demanded I would know by what authority I am brought here. To Charles, this was unthinkable. A king could not be tried by his subjects. He believed he was defending not just himself, but the divine order of the world. To the court, his silence was taken as a guilty plea. He was convicted as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the Commonwealth of England and sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, Charles showed a dignity and courage many hadn't expected. He wore 2 shirts to avoid shivering in the cold, not wanting the crowd to mistake it for fear. On the scaffold, he gave a final speech not to the distant crowd but to those nearby. He forgave his executioners, but insisted he died a martyr of the people, believing their true liberty lay in having a government, not participating in it. He declared, "A subject and a sovereign are clean different things." Then he laid his head on the block. One stroke of the axe, and King Charles' head fell. A groan rose from the crowd, a sound of horror and disbelief. England had killed its king. So was Charles III a tyrant or a martyr? The truth, as usual, lies in between. He was not an evil man, but he was a terrible king for his time. He ruled England as if it were Scotland. He imposed absolutist ideas of divine right on a nation with a strong tradition of law and representative liberties. His tragedy was his utter inability to compromise. He saw every disagreement as a challenge to his divine authority and personal dignity. In a rapidly changing world, his rigidity was a death sentence. Charles' death did not bring a stable republic. It led to 11 years of Oliver Cromwell and military rule, a dictatorship in all but name. Ultimately, in 1660, England, exhausted by chaos, invited Charles as a son back to restore the monarchy. But one thing changed forever. The dream of a king ruling by absolute divine right in England died with Charles on the scaffold. From that day, no English monarch dared forget the lesson that their power came not from God alone, but from the consent of those they governed. The king's death paved the way for one of England's most controversial figures. To understand the 11 years when England had no king, you must watch Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan revolutionary who became a tyrant. Subscribe to explore the story of the man who led a revolution in the name of liberty, but ended up ruling as a king without a crown.